I'm Ashley Montgomery, founder and CEO of Quilt to End ALZ. Welcome to our 2022 Block of the Month Quilt-Along. All right, it's December 21st. Our theme for the 2022 year at Quilt to End ALZ is one stitch at a time. And we're really focusing on the fact that I feel like I am just scattered and scrambling, trying to keep up, trying to finish the things on my to-do list, trying to tackle all the projects that I want to do, but just having a hard time with the time management and finding the moment to do those things. So we are really going to focus on slowing down, focusing on one project, and just enjoying the present. So our Block of the Month program, the first one that we've ever done, is called Fleeting, and it goes in line with that theme of moments and time is fleeting. So we need to make sure that we are present and enjoying every moment to its fullest. Welcome, thank you for being here. Let's get started with January's block. The Fleeting Quilt Topper uses 5 different fabrics. You can see back here the stack that we've chosen to use for the sample, and we'll be selling some of these fabric kits on the Quilt to End ALZ website. We're going to label them as letters. So this pink is our fabric A, the rust or kind of orangey sunset color is B, the robin's egg blue is C, we're using an off-white cream color for fabric D, and then we've got this deep jewel tone teal dark foresty green color that we are using for fabric E. We will refer to those fabrics A through E throughout the entire program, and I really recommend that if you use a different set of fabrics, I think you could use anything. I think any theme, any colorway, patterns, I think anything is going to look really beautiful in this pattern. I do recommend that you keep your 5 fabrics in a lot of contrast so that when they're up next to each other, the pattern really pops. So for January's block, we are doing what I call a modified 9 patch. We basically have 9 8.5-inch squares that are going into this 3 rows by 3 columns. It's just that each of our 9 patches is made up of a block. So we've got in our 4 corners, we have a 4 patch that one of the patches is made up of a checkerboard, and then our other 3 are just basic plain block patches. And then on the center row and center column, we're doing a square in square block. So it looks complex. It's a nice big block. It's going to finish in the quilt at 24. So what we're creating today is raw edge 24.5 by 24.5 inch square. And even though it looks big and complex, it's actually very easy to put together. So let's get started. I've already cut the fabric per the instructions. So let's move over here to the overhead camera and I'll show you what we're going to need. In fabric D, which is my cream color, I need 1 6.25 inch square. Out of fabric C, I'm going to cut 2 4 7/8 inch squares, and then I'm going to slice them on the diagonal to create 4 triangles. I'm going to do the same thing for my other 4 square and square blocks. So out of fabric A, which is my pink, I have 4 6.25 inch squares, and I end up with 8 triangles, and I do that by cutting my 4 squares that are 4 7/8 and then slicing on the diagonal. And then for my corner blocks, I need 4 4-inch squares out of fabric A. I need 8 2-inch squares out of fabric D. And then I'm going to do the same 2 cuts with fabric E. I've got 8 4-inch squares. Sorry about that. Lots of 4s and 8s running around here. So I have 8 4-inch squares and I have 8 2-inch squares. So those are all the fabric pieces that we're going to need. Step 1 of the instructions is to make our center square in square. So we're going to use our cream colored square. This is the 6.25, and I recommend that you go ahead and fold it over and just kind of finger crease in the center and then fold it over the other way to do the same thing. Now you've created just a little crease of crosshairs. and we're going to take our triangle and we're going to lay it in, and the point of the triangle is going to line up on that line that we made, just above the crosshairs. Let me show you that on our overhead camera as well. I've created the little crease by folding it halfway, both directions, and then I'm going to lay my triangle along the long edge, and I'm going to line up the point with my little crease to make sure it's in the center. If you would like to pin that, it'll make sure that it doesn't move on you. And then we're going to do the same thing with another triangle. So I'm just going to lay that back. I'm going to put my straight side here, the base of my triangle, on the opposite corner of my square. Make sure that the tip of the triangle is lined up on that halfway crease, and I'm just going to put a little pin in it. All right, so now we're ready to stitch that together. You probably don't have to pin this. I am going to treat our tutorials as if everyone in the tutorial is a beginner. I do not claim to be an expert seamstress or quilter. I've been quilting for 23 years now, but I still have a lot to learn. And there will be blocks that we might choose to do half square triangles, and if you're a more experienced quilter, you may like the idea of doing like a flying geese in that place, and that's great. You create this quilt in the way that makes the most amount of sense to you. All right, so I've done one stitch here, and now I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. I love blocks like this that look complex when you just see it in the quilt. And even when you read the instructions, I try and really spell out what the steps are. That way, if you are a beginner quilter, you don't feel lost in all of the steps or assuming that you know how to do something. All right, so here is our block, and we have our stitch line on each side. I'm going to set the stitches by just setting my hot iron on top of it for 3-5 seconds. Do both sides, and then I'm going to open this up, and if you just fold this back, your seam allowance is going to be under the darker color, which is ideal. We can't always do that, but I try to as much as possible so that you don't see the seam allowance underneath the lighter fabric, especially our cream colored off-white. It might do that. And then I'm going to turn it and do the exact same thing again on this side. All right, very nice. So this is where we're at. We've got our square with 2 triangles on the opposite sides. I'll lay that underneath there so you can see one more time. And now we're going to do the exact same process, but we're going to do it on these other sides. So I'm going to lay the base of my triangle, and I can still see that crease that I made, although it's a little faint, so I think I'm going to refold it. And I accidentally ironed it right out. Just do another little finger press here to create a seam. That makes it so much easier to keep your triangle all lined up just right. And I'll put a pin in just to... I laid batting down so that I had a nice light background for you to see. And of course my pen wants to go into the batting. All right, and the other side, let's pick that up so that we can get that right on the crease. Perfect. Put a little pin in that. And now let's go sew it. We're using a 1/4 inch seam allowance throughout the whole project. If you don't have a 1/4 inch guide foot, I do recommend it as a beginner quilter. It's hard to visualize a perfect 1/4 inch. And really and truly for a project like this, as long as you're consistent with your 1/4 inch, your quilt's going to come together beautifully. But if we are working on a block swap or a community quilt, something where different people are bringing blocks together, or sometimes your measurements just really have to be precise for a block to come together just right. And so it's just a good habit to master that 1/4 inch seam. It's something that I still want to get better at every time I sew. All right, so we've done the same thing, and I'm going to take my pin out, press. Remember, we're going to set our stitches. The heat draws the thread in just a little bit, and that helps set your stitches in place. And then we're going to open up the piece we just stitched on and do that on both sides. Now we have our square in a square block. We do want to trim this to 8.5 inches, and I want to show you how I'm going to do that, because we want to make sure that our square points stay centered. So I'm going to grab my big, this is one of my large square rulers, and I'm going to line up, let's see, we'll do it underneath here so you can see it, and then I'll move it back over to set on the cutting board. But I want to make sure that these points stay centered. So I can't just lay this down and say, oh, here's 8.5, cut from there. So what I need to do is make sure that I have my 4 1/4, and I have a little, the leg of the camera is kind of in the way, so I'm going to slide that down. But essentially, we need the 4 1/4 to be right on our little points here and here. And this is going to create our 1/4 inch seam allowance whenever we sew this in. So you'll do this, and then, oh, I'm on 4 3/4. Y'all probably noticed that quicker than I did. All right, 4 1/4, so there's 4 1/4, and then this is a 1/4 inch down. So I really want that to be right on that tip. Just center it in there. It's perfect down here, perfect up here. So I'm going to do that, and then I'm going to rotate it around and do the same thing, and that's how we create our 8.5 inch square. All right, so I am going to do that one more time over here on the actual cutting mat. And it just trims up that block so that everything comes together really well. You don't have much to trim. The measurements that we use for the square and square are pretty darn close. All right, same thing. My center is on my 4 1/4. I'm going to do the same thing again. The center is on the 4 1/4, and I'm just going to trim right here. All right, so now we have a square in a square, 8.5 inches with the raw edges. This is going to be the center of our big 24 inch 9-patch block. Step 2 is to do the exact same process, but this time we're going to do it with our pink and green, or your fabric A and E. Same process, do this 4 more times. Okay, we're back. We are going to move on to step 3 of our instructions. Let's come over and look at the overhead cam. We are going to be creating a 4-patch, and one of the patches of the 4 is made up of a little checkerboard. So that's where our small squares come in. We have 8 2.5 inch squares in our cream color, and then we have 8 in our darkest color. So we're going to create a little 4-patch that's going to look just like this. Easy enough. So I'm going to start by sewing all of my whites to my greens, and I'm just going to chain stitch this to fly right through. I like to do chain stitching anytime I can fit it into a pattern. It keeps the thread nice and taut on the machine. It's fast, it's easy, it helps us get through anything that's a repetitive block or a repetitive stitch over and over again. And I tend to have 2 or more quilts going at one time, and I'm able to have one under the machine and one waiting, and that way I always have something to put under. If you follow Bonnie Hunter, she is a phenomenal quilter, and she calls these leaders and enders, and she may not be the one who came up with that phrase, but I know she's made it very popular. But leaders and enders are a great way to use your stash as well, if you cut them down into certain sizes, and you always have a little something to finish off or begin a line of stitching. And it just helps us to make sure that we've got a nice tension on the machine. Okay, that is the last of our chain stitching here, and I'm going to, oh, I got that one a little wonky, didn't I? I'm gonna have to restitch that one. I got a little catch in my bobbin on that one. That happens. I can tell you, I used to panic anytime something weird happened with the machine, and I have yet to create a quilt that doesn't require the seam ripper at some phase. I don't even know if I've ever done a single block that I didn't use my seam ripper or restitch a little here or there. I did. I pulled these a little too tight, didn't I? If you have this fun little contraption on your machine, this is a little blade for trimming when you are chain stitching, and it's awesome. I love it. All right, so the next step is to press open our little squares. We're going to do the same thing that we did before. We're going to set the stitches, just putting heat on them for 3 to 5 seconds. And then I like to have the dark fabric up, fold it back, and again, that puts our seam allowance under the dark fabric instead of under the light fabric. And I'm just going to do 2 of these right now because I want to show you how to keep moving through this block, and I'll come back and press these open when I need them in just a minute. All right, so we now have 2 of our little rectangular units, and we are going to sandwich these together to make our checkerboard. When you are doing this, and again, I'm making the videos for beginner quilters, so if you are an experienced quilter and you don't need this, just ignore me. But one of the tips that I learned from a phenomenal quilter in one of my beginner classes was to take a pin and put it through the stitching about 2 stitches down, which should be around 1/4 inch, and then bring that through, and then do the same thing going into the other side, right in the stitch line. Now you've created a spot where your needle is going to come through, and then you can feel, kind of just flatten that down to sandwich those together. Make sure that the tops are nice and level, and then you just fold that pin down and push it back through the stitching. Let me put that under the camera so you can see that a little bit. So I've gone through the stitching on each side 1/4 inch down, then I sandwiched them together and then just laid the pin down. Now when I'm sewing, my needle should go in exactly where that pin is joining those 2 pieces. And so let's do that. The one nuisance I find with the 1/4 inch quilting foot is that it does like to catch the pins. But I've learned just to use my thumb to pick it up a little bit and get over the pins. Different sewing machines probably are a little different. But let me show you under the overhead cam one more time. You can see exactly where my stitch went right in that top pin spot. And now I'm going to set my seam with the heat. And then I'm going to open it up. Now, a little trick for these 4 patches, let's come over here with the overhead cam. A little trick here is that you have a natural way that this is going to open. And when you do that, it keeps your bulk. Sometimes you have to go from one side to the other, but if possible, I like to open this up. It kind of makes this little fan. Actually, I've heard it called that, fanning open your seams. So one naturally lays one way, one lays the other. Same thing happens on the other 2 sides. Now you're going to say, oh, but my seam allowance is going to the light fabric. I mentioned earlier, sometimes we can't avoid that, but I do like to keep as much bulk out of my seam allowance as possible. So I'm going to go over here and press this open just like that. Another good tip to remember as a beginner quilter is that we are pressing, not ironing. Do I move the iron around? Yes, a little bit, but I'm not pushing when I do that. I'm just kind of picking it up, rolling it over, making sure that I'm not manipulating the give of the fabric. You know how our fabric, even tightly woven fabrics, have some stretch to them. All right, so here we go. We have our little 4 patch, which is going to be one of our 4 patch for our corner blocks. And this needs to be trimmed down to 4.5 inches. So I'm going to check it, and it's pretty perfect. So nothing to trim there. And now this is going to go with my, and I think maybe in my instructions I even said to go ahead and make our rectangle, but I'm going to just lay this out and show you how this is going to fit together. It's going to be, oh, I'm lying, it's going to be, the nice thing about diagrams is that you can follow along, and if it makes sense to you to put these together in a different order, you do what makes sense for you. But this is our 4 patch right here. So it's got our 2 dark fabrics, our light fabric, and our little checkerboard. And so I'm going to sew these 2 together. Perfect. And I'm going to do the same thing, sewing these 2 together. And I'm making my tall rectangles that are going to fit together. Alrighty, now let's press these open. I know you're probably getting tired of hearing me say it, but we're going to set the seams. A little bit of heat. With the darker fabric up, we're going to fold it back. Press that rectangle open. And I had a little bit of folding crease from where I had cut these and then set them aside. So I'm going to kind of press that out as well. Same thing with our other little rectangular unit here. Press that open. And now because I am creating this 4 patch where the dark fabrics are in opposite corners, by pressing to the dark both times, when I put this together like this, my seams are going to sandwich. So let's go through that little tip that I gave you a minute ago. You're going to take one fabric. Tell you what, I'm going to do this under the camera. All right, so these are going to sandwich together. I'm going to take one fabric and I'm going to put my pin about 2 stitches down, and it's going to come right through. You can see that it comes right through the seam line. And then I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to put this in on this side about 2 stitches down, and it's coming right through the seam line. Then I'm going to push these together, and you can feel how that seam sandwiches. I'm going to check my edges, make sure that they're nice and together. This is also a great way to for the blocks to be forgiving. That's why I like blocks that are forgiving. They come together well, and if you're not a perfect seamstress, as I am not, it helps you to hide any imperfections in your seam allowance. All right, so let's stitch this together. All right, you know what the next step is. Go ahead and set. We can do that little fan Again, let me show it to you in case that's helpful. We have a 4-patch, so we can set this, and it's going to just naturally happen when this is opened up. This is going to open right here. This little piece will come back, this piece will come forward, and I'm noticing that I have very little seam allowance right here, and that makes me a little bit nervous. So I'm going to just stitch, and I think I just had a little bulk, and so my machine may have hopped just a little bit. I'm going to put one more little stitch right there. The reason that we want to make sure that our seam allowance is pretty close to 1/4 inch is that as fabrics are washed, of course, you know, they can fray a little bit, and we don't want to be so close on the edge that as a quilt is used and loved and washed and folded and put away and all that good stuff, we want to make sure that we've allowed enough space that that fraying won't cause blocks to come loose. So I just wanted to make sure, I felt like I was a little too close on that seam, so I just turned it over the other direction so I could really see that side. I'm going to set that one more time. And that's just part of the quilting process. Again, there may be some people out there that are really perfect quilters that don't have to do that, but I check every single seam that I sew to make sure that I've allowed enough space. All right, and then because I've got the double stitches in there, I really feel like my bulk is going to be better if I just do the seam allowance all over to one side. Again, you're going to test it, you're going to play with it, see how your fabric falls. We are using a combination of Art Gallery fabric and Riley Blake solids, and they have a beautiful texture to them, and they really press over nicely. And here is our block. So we're going to make 4 of these, and we're going to trim them to 8.5 inches, just like we did our square and square blocks. Okay, so we have our 4 corner blocks, we have our 5 square and square, and that is going to come together to create our 9-patch. So you can see in the diagram that from here, you're just going to put the 3 top row pieces together, the 3 middle row pieces together, the 3 bottom row, and then you'll sew the rows together. I like to press between each row so that the block itself is going to be nice and flat. So here's your January block. I'm so glad that you're here. Please go into our Facebook group or on the website. Leave us some comments, show us pictures, let us know how you're doing with the fleeting block, and know that we're all here doing this together. Thanks so much. See you next month.